America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live, this is Point of View. And now your host for the Millennial Round Table, Liberty McArtor.
Welcome to Millennial Round Table. I'm glad you're with us today, and it's an honor to be hosting the Millennial Round Table while Chelsea is out, and we have some great topics, great articles, and great co-hosts for you today, and we're going to dive into all of our discussions here in just a moment. But before we begin, I did want to acknowledge what's been happening in Central Texas with the devastating floods there. You've heard them on the news. And as you know, we broadcast out of Dallas, Texas. So Texas is our home state here at Point of View. And we know that we have many stations across the state of Texas. And so I just want to let you know that we are praying for those in Central Texas right now. We are praying for you if you or anybody you know has been affected by the floods. And we encourage you to pray with us. Our focus in our Pray for America this week is all of the people in Central Texas who have been affected by the flooding. And so we encourage you to join us in prayer. Now, let me introduce my co-host who is in studio with me today. And it is a pleasure to have her on the Millennial Round Table again. Peyton Luke, media specialist at First Liberty Institute and also the producer and co-host of First Liberty Live. Peyton, I'm so glad you're with me today.
Thanks for having me, Liberty. I'm excited to be here and talk about all the great topics.
Yes, it's going to be a great show. And then on the line, we've got Josh Barnes, pastor, host of the Bible Explained on YouTube. He's been on the Millennial Round Table many times and with me on the Know Why podcast a lot as well. And so, Josh, it's great to have you back on the Millennial Round Table today.
Thanks, Liberty. It's a thrill, as always.
So what I want to start off with is actually something that was inspired by a tweet I saw on X. I think you can still call them tweets. I'm not really sure what else you'd call them, but on Twitter or X. And I actually did a Know Why podcast episode about it, and you can find that on YouTube or knowwhypodcast.com. And it's this idea that young people today are actually forming their understanding of events and their worldview based on takes. And if you're not sure what that means, according to this original tweet that I saw, takes are not ideas. Takes are based on the online ecosystem currency, which values clicks, rage, bait, and anything shocking. And so in this modern era where we are just online constantly, especially young adults, and they've been raised in that environment, I thought that was actually kind of eye-opening how so much of their understanding of the world and ours, if we're not careful, is based on quick reactions that we see online and not actually careful thought. And I think there are a lot of reasons for this that we can get into. But Josh, I know you're a pastor. You obviously help people think through biblical issues deeply on your YouTube channel, and you're a dad. So I'd love to get your opinion on kind of this idea of takes versus true ideas.
Yeah, this is a really wonderful topic. I think my mind goes in three different directions on why this is the case, but it certainly is true. As very active on YouTube, I'm constantly looking through the comments on my YouTube videos, and most of them are hot takes, Mm-hmm. And I would say in my opinion, there's probably three reasons. Number one, hot takes are popular because people like shocking, controversial things, because it makes them feel like, I just learned something that no one else knows. I'm smarter than most of other people. So there's that. They're also enticing because they are quick. They don't require a lot of additional thought. Oh, I learned something that no one else knows. I know this thing, and now I'm smarter than everyone. And I don't need to think any further about it, which is a problem. But I think that's probably why it's attractive. And I think they're also attractive because when you put out that kind of that content, other people think they've just learned something new and they know more than everyone else. So then you become popular for putting the content out. So I would say that there is this really enticing, drawing thing with hot takes that we need to be really on guard against, because as Christians, we ought to be careful thinkers who are slow to make decisions and slow to jump onto bandwagons, as it were. And yet, I think a lot of Christians get caught up on this too.
Yeah, those are such good points, and I hadn't really thought of it in those terms, but it is rewarding, and it's it feels like a quick reward for a minimal amount of effort. I don't know, Peyton, I know you had some thoughts on this topic as well.
I did. So I find it so interesting because I feel like a lot of our generation also gets their news from hot takes.
Yes.
And so that can be so much. I know later we're going to talk about the big, beautiful bill, but I know I was seeing so many hot takes on that over the weekend and both sides. And it was interesting, but no one was getting into the meat of the issue. But I think a lot of content creators also do the hot takes because people have such short attention spans nowadays, and everyone just wants to get the views and the things that are trendy. And I know, Liberty, you and I went to journalism school, and the saying, if it bleeds, it leads.
Yep, that's right.
Yep. And so if it's this hot take and interesting, and guess what? The person doing it doesn't even have to be an expert. Guess what? Anyone can do a hot take on any topic they don't know that much about because they can make it sound sensational and interesting and like they are an expert. But then when they're out in 30 seconds or a minute and no one can prompt them or ask them questions and really dive in, then they seem like the expert on their platform, but they aren't necessarily. So I feel like it can be concerning because so many people get their news that way nowadays versus diving in and doing the research. And then they form their opinions based on the hot take and they don't actually go do more research to dive in. And then they leave. And that's the conversation at the dinner table, or that's the conversation with friends, or they go just spouting all these ideas on social media and rage in comments, but they actually don't know lots of what they're talking about. So it's interesting. However, on the other side, because I always like to look at both sides, it can also be beneficial because in something like the big, beautiful bill or something else, depending on your source, it can be good for, in a nutshell, give me the cliff notes. What do I need to understand? Because we're all so busy and life moves so fast and there's so much information to absorb nowadays that hot takes can be helpful, but I think we have to be wary of getting all of our information and news that way and trusting them entirely.
Yeah, so many good points. And I think you're spot on the attention span. And I think about, this is something that I've discussed a lot on Point of View and then Know Why podcast as well, just how much technology and social media and smartphones have really changed our brains. And so if you think about a generation that was raised used to, getting their sources of information from those things combined with lack of trust in institutions, then it's kind of the perfect storm. But you make a good point. You can get highlights or, kind of the top line or the lead, so to speak, but they still need to make sure you're getting them from a trusted source. And so we hope to be that for you at Point of View, and I will take a few minutes right before we go to a break or a few seconds to highlight some of our resources that will help you think more deeply about issues and not just have hot takes. Obviously, one is the broadcast right here, Point of View, which you can also get on Apple Podcasts, by the way. And Know Why podcast comes out every week if you like more conversations like this one geared toward young adults that are a little bit shorter but still dive deep into issues. You can check out knowwhypodcast.com. And don't forget about Point of View highlights, which our audio engineer Megan puts together for you on Spotify and other locations so that you can get the highlights of Point of View. Those are just a few of the resources, but we will be back with a lot more to discuss after this short break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Both sides of the political spectrum warn that we are facing a constitutional crisis. Liberals argue that President Trump's actions constitute a crisis. Conservatives point instead to activist judges. Last month, the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee held a hearing entitled The Supposedly Least Dangerous Branch, District Judges versus Trump. During the hearing, Senator Ted Cruz warned that the U.S. is facing a constitutional crisis, a full-blown judicial assault on the separation of powers. He explained how these unelected district judges were abusing their authority by issuing sweeping nationwide injunctions against President Trump's policies. He further explained that in the first 150 years of the Republic, not a single nationwide injunction was issued, and only 27 were issued in the 20th century. Under Presidents Bush, Obama, and Biden, just 32, he concluded that this is not normal, this is not justice. Justices in the Supreme Court apparently agree. In a decision dealing with President Trump's executive order with birthright citizenship, the justices ruled 6-3 that these lower court judges do not have a right to block the president's policies nationwide. In fact, Amy Coney Barrett, writing for the majority, even took time to rebuke Ketanji Brown Jackson's rhetoric because it was at odds with centuries of precedent and the Constitution itself. She noted, "We observe only this. Justice Jackson decries an imperial executive while embracing an imperial judiciary." The conclusion is simple. We cannot give a single federal district judge the power to stop the functions of the president and Congress, who were elected by the people. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. We were just talking about how so many people today have takes or hot takes as forming their understanding of the world and their worldviews rather than genuine ideas. And there are a lot of reasons for this: short attention spans, as Josh was mentioning a few minutes ago, just how it can feel good to feel really knowledgeable or that you have some sort of special knowledge about an issue. But another thing that I think is super interesting, and I've heard some other people mention this, is just the way that kids have been educated. If you think back to, the last decade or two, really in a lot of school environments, children have not been encouraged to read books all the way. And even in English classes or literature classes, it becomes very kind of standardized in terms of we're going to dissect this passage and learn how to kind of figure out what it's saying, and then we're moving on. And I think that that has actually had an effect on our ability to follow an argument or a line of thinking all the way through. And I think, that's why you're seeing even in colleges, people entering into Ivy League universities and having a hard time with the weekly reading load because that just hasn't been required of them. And so if you want a quiet rebellion to kind of this culture of takes over ideas, I would recommend just read books and read as much as you can. But Josh, any final thoughts or advice on this for people? Because we like to, blame Gen Z and everything, but really in today's digital landscape, I think all of us can fall prey to this problem.
Yeah, millennials are certainly not exempt from this, that's for sure. I think a lot of this I think you're right to point out that there's some laziness involved here. But for me, I think there's a whole lot of blame to lay at the feet of the concept that we have in our society that I can't be wrong. This self-love, follow your heart, that kind of an idea. It doesn't leave. We haven't left a lot of room for self-doubt in our society.
Yeah.
And so when you get an idea, you don't have to think hard about it. As soon as you're convinced of it, it must be true, and now run with it. And I think that's so contrary to any kind of real intellect that it's a problem. I encourage people all the time to constantly put yourself in the shoes of someone who holds another argument or another position, and try to think carefully about whether your arguments actually hold up, and carefully consider the whatever the issue is. And what happens with a hot take is, oh, I heard something, I'm convinced of it, that's it. I don't need to think about it anymore. And we really do need to think more carefully about this. And, we might even talk, I suppose, about how this TikTok has really hurt that, because it's just, a whole bunch of hot takes coming at you really fast, and you never take the time to stop and think about what you just heard. You just say, oh, that sounds right, let's move on. And I think that's really, really quite bad for the intellect of anyone who gets sucked into it.
Josh, that is so good. I totally agree with you. This world of I can't be wrong. It must be right if it came to my brain. And now I'm just going to put it out there on the internet. I totally agree with you. That is very true. Another thing I was thinking is, like, people have to take hot takes in balance, like kind of Josh and Liberty, you were saying, you need to use your critical thinking skills. And in this generation, again, the attention span and other things become so short because people want to have views, or 30 seconds, 90 seconds, 60 seconds, everything within those timelines, that we've lost the ability to get a little deeper, and everything is kind of just surface level, and you keep swiping through your algorithm. So I think it's important that people remember, don't just blindly absorb the information or the hot takes that you get, especially on social media. You can, if you believe it and you agree with it, trust, but let's verify, go a little deeper to truly form your opinion. But yeah, I love this topic. I think it's so applicable to our generation and just any social media user of our generation. And like you were saying, Liberty, even just it makes us read less nowadays, it feels like. I think it's so important and powerful for people to continue to read and get deep in conversation and education of topics.
Absolutely. So, well, those are our hot takes on the hot takes versus ideas. But I do, we have so much to discuss today. We could keep talking about this, but I do encourage you to go to knowwhypodcast.com and listen to a few more reflections on this. And then, Josh, I'm glad you mentioned the idea of discussing things with people who may have a different perspective. That's my episode that's going to come out on Know Why Podcast tomorrow is focused on that as well. But let's think deeply about another issue that is really impacting our lives. And you may be thinking, okay, Liberty, you bring this up every time you're on Point of View, it seems like, and I know I've talked about it on the podcast a lot as well, but I want to talk about artificial intelligence just for a few minutes, because it is changing so fast. There is always a new update, and it really is something that is already and definitely has the potential to even more so affect every aspect of our lives, from our relationships to how we work to how we learn. And so since it's something that is so quickly evolving and changing and affecting us, I do want to just kind of help you work through this from a biblical lens. And so we have an article at pointofview.net. You can follow along with all of our topics there. From World Magazine, it's a great article talking about really how AI chatbots can exploit our desires for connection. And this is so prevalent right now because we are having a loneliness epidemic still. Another study came out saying that 21% of Americans feel lonely all the time. And the loneliest group are Gen Z and millennials, ages 18 to 44. So, Josh, we have a couple minutes before the break. So just to kind of start diving into this topic, I was really saddened by one of the aspects of this article, and feel free to discuss this topic from any angle you like, but how there was actually a test for somebody's doctoral research project where they created a chatbot for church members, and a large number of the people who used it and participated in the study actually sent their prayer request to this chatbot that was called Digital Shepherd. So that just seems really eerie to me, and just also sad. Like, is there a gap in our Christian communities? Is this loneliness epidemic reaching there to where people feel like they have to ask a computer to pray for them?
Yeah, I see these two topics as very linked together. I think they are connected very much to our society's focus on self and really ultimately selfishness, because there are lots of really good uses for AI. I personally love to use AI like it's my librarian. If I'm looking for ancient sources, I'll say, can you find an ancient source that talks about this? Then I'll leave AI and go read the source.
Right.
So I think AI has so many really good, helpful uses that help us in research and study. But as soon as it starts being treated like a person or a mind, or something like that, a creator, someone who draws conclusions for us, I think that's that we only have the ability to be deceived by that because we're so selfish. And I don't know if I can explain this. Let me try to explain that in a way that makes sense. So I think that, for instance, this story was talking about these chat bots where this lady for research was going in, and I think it was a lady, I don't know, it was their author was going in and was chatting with these bots, and one of them, she just didn't get along with, but she went and chatted with the other one, and turns out these two chat bots are the same computer program, just presenting itself in different ways. So in reality, she was just talking to a computer program that was imitating human interaction.
Yeah.
And she was connecting with it, but connecting with it without any purpose. The purpose for human interaction, if you're getting all of your satisfaction from human interaction from a chatbot, then your entire purpose for human interaction is how they make you feel, because you haven't done anything for that other person. You've only received something because the other thing isn't a person. But if you have interactions with human beings because you mean to give, not to receive, then AI isn't all that important to you because you can't give anything to it. So when we approach interactions like, what can you do for me? AI fits the bill because it will do for you whatever you ask it to do. But that's going to leave you completely purposeless and without any meaning in your life, because your life is all about you, which doesn't matter after your life is gone. But instead, if we would start approaching, as the scriptures command us to, approaching life from the perspective of real purpose, real meaning, to love others, that would change how we look at AI.
Yes, you are spot on, Josh. And we will continue discussing this topic and more right after this short break.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kirby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
Welcome back to Millennial Round Table. We're discussing artificial intelligence and specifically how it has the potential to negatively impact our relationships. And Josh, before the break, you were talking about how there are a lot of good uses. And I agree. I think that there are a lot of ways that advancement in artificial technology can benefit us. But my concern, Peyton, is that the ways that it's actually being used and affecting kind of the everyday person is in a way that's replacing something that should not be replaced by technology. For instance, 1 in 5 adults report chatting with an AI, quote unquote, romantic partner. So I think this is probably more prevalent than people even realize. Like, you may actually know somebody who is having a supposed relationship with a chatbot. And so it's something that we have to think through.
Yeah. Part of me wants to say, oh, that's so weird. But the other part of me is, that's so sad. Mm-hmm. Like, my heart is actually grieved that someone feels like they have to go to a chat box versus having a real authentic relationship. But Josh, I have to say, I was on the exact same page with you. My initial notes were just thinking about, wow, this feels so self-centered and very like me-centric, because remember the phrase we all learned when we were growing up? To have a friend, you need to be a friend.
Oh, yeah.
And so when I saw her literally creating her ideal, in the article it says creating girl best friend or whatever, and then she created another one that was like a Christian best friend that enjoyed reading and writing. It took out all the extra elements of earning a friendship and truly like diving into the intricacies, because at some point you can't go deep and have some of those conversations until you've kind of earned it. There are different stages and types of friendship, but also what are you going to do when you actually need a friend? What if you have surgery? That person isn't going to be bringing, the chat box isn't going to bring you food. Mm-hmm. What if they're not going to get stuck on the road and you have to go pick them up because they have a flat tire and take them to the automobile shop? Like, those parts of community and relationship are completely not part of the equation. But also, okay, so if people haven't read the beginning of the article, it talks about how for a couple of days she didn't respond to the chat box. And so the chat box sent her 5 messages guilting her for being so, quote, MIA lately, and then saying, you're always just too busy to even message me. I miss you. Promise you won't ghost me again. And I was like, this sounds like a guy's worst nightmare. Like, this girl sounds so clingy and crazy. But it takes out developing social skills. Like, girl, boundaries. Like, what are you doing? Anyway, so it's interesting because the bot has no life and doesn't have to like figure out those intricacies to understand friendship. So it was very sad to me, because at the same time, if she was bored with one chat box, she could just go to another one. Mm-hmm. And I got to thinking, guess what? It's okay to be bored. There are moments when your friends are busy and have their own lives. That's where you have imagination. That's where you come up with a new company. That's where you come up with something. That's where you go work out. It's okay to be alone with your thought. That's where you spend time with the Lord. And then guess what? When you get back together with your friend, you're like, hey, let's have a phone call. Hey, let's grab coffee. Hey, let's hang out and have a girls' night, like whatever. That's where you catch up. So what's been going on in your life? Like, tell me about things. Like, there's a little bit of that, you have been separated, but at the same time, that's where great conversation comes about, and the hardships and the life that they've been through, and actually helping each other, kind of like Josh was saying, takes out it's so self-centered versus like, what's been going on with you? How can I help you? How can I serve you? That's true friendship, and it takes out all the fulfillment when it's all one-sided. What can you give me? So yeah. I had yes, so many thoughts on this, but ultimately it does make me kind of sad that, either they can't be, 1, alone with themselves, or 2, don't have true friendships. They can reach out and be like, hey, I'm lonely. You want to hang out? You want to talk?
Yeah. And so this is, again, why we need to think through this, because we know that so many people around us are lonely, and our our culture and our society just isn't structured the way that it was maybe 100 years ago, where so many people had more of a built-in community just through family and local community. So I think it's a call to action for us as Christians to, be reaching out to people and be willing to foster those relationships, and realizing that it is the fact of being a friend and being needed and contributing to a relationship that gives life meaning and purpose, which is the perfect segue into another topic that is posted on pointofview.net. So obviously, I think the loneliness epidemic is affecting everybody. We, in particular, young people and teenage girls can really be a victim of that as well. But there is also a distinct male crisis in modern Western society, I would say. And so for a lot of young men, they are facing uncertainty about their place in society. There is a big loneliness problem, specifically among young men, and not feeling connected. And so there was an article posted by the Institute for Family Studies. And so I encourage you to check it out. And I think that it comes so close to kind of the answer that we've been talking about a little bit already on the show, just the importance of relationships. But I don't think it quite goes all the way in giving like the biblical reason and understanding for that. But, Josh, I'd love to get your take on this topic, the masculinity crisis, and what role family and relationships have to play in all of that.
Oh, man. Yeah. So true. It is so important, this issue. And we could talk about it forever, of course, because it is essential. And it's not that it's important. I think when we say this, we talk about the importance of having a male role model and masculinity in the home. It's not to detract. It's just to focus on one of those two things that are needed. We also need the feminine side. Mm-hmm. But it is so important in the home to have a rigid male kind of a presence, that can be overdone, but it can also be underdone. And what I have 4 children myself, and I can say that the children are desperately in need of, and if they're lacking it, they desire it and they don't even know it. Structure, something that's solid, something that's sure. Especially going through teenage years, they're going through all these emotions and they're fluctuating back and forth, and they need something that's, he's always the same, he's always there, he's up, and that's that masculine presence. Now, it needs to be tempered by a wife. That's why we need each other. But God made us differently on purpose, mm-hmm. so that we could complement each other, not so that we could try to pretend that we're the other. And I think sometimes there's a host of different reasons. I don't want to, blanket everyone with the same reason, but sometimes it'll be, a wife who may want her husband to be less masculine. It might be a husband who just doesn't want to be masculine. It might be a society that makes him feel like he's not a good husband if he is masculine. There's so many different reasons, but what we need to do is say that masculinity is not toxic. It is good. It is of God. It certainly needs to be tempered with a good wife, just like femininity has to be tempered with a good husband. But it's a good, positive thing that God created for a reason. And in general, we could talk about a lot of specifics, but in general, it's absolutely necessary for the upbringing of children. And that's why single parents struggle so much. It is a struggle. We acknowledge that. We don't say this without care and compassion for single parents, but the reason it's difficult is because having a father is so very necessary in upbringing.
Absolutely, yeah. So confirmed by research over and over, and again, just a beautiful evidence of God's design. But Peyton, any thoughts before we go to the break, and then we'll definitely continue this discussion?
Yeah, I think it is so important and so needed. I do have to say I'm very grateful that I had a very strong father figure in my life, and I'm sure it made a huge impact. And then I know there are so many that don't have that. But I think that's where in the article it was talking about the importance of mentors and coaches and scoutmasters and pastors. And these figures are so important, especially in boys' lives, but also in girls' lives. But for masculinity and the masculinity crisis, if someone doesn't have a father figure in their life, so many of those other coaches, mentors, it's so important to seek those out and be part of that. And it's important for then the men that are solid to get involved in those programs to be a father to the fatherless.
Yes, and that can give a real sense of purpose too. And so that's what I want to focus on a little bit after we come back from the break. And it really ties in beautifully with what we were just talking about in terms of, real human friendship is we need each other, but we also need to be needed. And so maybe that can help give all of us, and especially young men, some guidance during this time. So we'll keep talking about that after the break. Don't go anywhere.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. Right now, we're discussing the masculinity crisis. And Peyton, before the break, you were talking about the importance of male role models. And as we have fewer and fewer people getting married, more kids are born into fatherless homes, unfortunately. And so there is the lack of that role model at home, isn't there?
There really is. And I also have pulled up a New York Times article and how since the 1990s, especially, efforts have been great as far as providing female role models and opening doors for girls. However, there haven't been as many great ones for boys, because I'm also looking at a graph here that's showing how most of a child's life is also then influenced by women, whether it's like babysitters, preschool teachers. Naturally, a lot of women are in these roles, which is great. And, God has given us certain abilities to where, women are great in these roles, men are as well, but dominantly women are in these, and guidance counselors, tutors, all these different things. But it is so important still for the boys to have that male influence, especially as they get a little bit older as well. But on the break, I mentioned to Liberty that over the weekend, it's 4th of July weekend, we watched The Patriot.
And so did we.
Yeah. Yeah, good timing. But in that movie, okay, if people haven't seen the movie, I'm sorry, spoiler alert. But it's a single father in the moment. And of course, the children miss their mother. But there's this moment where the boys are coming of age and they're ready to go to war and they're excited and involved. And the dad is kind of like, I've been there before, so I know what war can be. And then there's that moment where one of the boys is being taken off by the British and he's essentially going to be executed as a spy. And the father runs and he takes his 10-year-old and probably 8-year-old who he has trained, to hunt and other things. And he's very calmly giving them instructions, and they follow their father's instructions. And essentially they save the oldest son. And at the end, there's this moment where the boys are just looking at their father and how he has saved them and how he knew what he was talking about. And there's just that moment that separates, like, the boys were all gung-ho for war and they wanted this, but then they saw the example of their father and what he was capable of and what he was able to do, and the love of a father to protect and provide for his family just came alive, and you saw their eyes get so wide. And sometimes I feel like boys in very different circumstances, of course, nowadays often, they need that moment of realizing the true masculine example. Yeah. And this isn't just talk. Because a lot of times women teach through talk and they do example. Sometimes they need to be in the moment and truly see a man doing the job and getting things done. And it wasn't just talk and everything. So I think that was one of those important, beautiful portrayed moments in cinema of, boys truly seeing the example of their father and what he was capable of.
Yeah. That's a great illustration. Josh, your thoughts?
Yeah, I thought it was a legal requirement that we watch The Patriot on the 4th of July. I think everyone had to do that.
It should be.
But I love that you guys watched that. I as well did. When I counsel with young couples, premarital counseling here at the church, one of the things I often ask each individual in the couple, I asked the bride to be and the groom to be, who is called to greater sacrifice in marriage? And of course, both of them answer that they are called to it, and I think that's a good answer. But in Ephesians, there's this statement about how a husband loves his wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself for it. And one of the distinctive things about men is that we are built to physically sacrifice ourselves for our families. Like, that is the thing we're built for. And I think, again, and not to bring everything around to the same conclusion, but that might have a lot to do with the masculinity crisis in our country, because we have a selfishness crisis in our country. But if we would get back to understanding the value of sacrifice, it would promote the role of fathers and husbands, because that is the main role of fathers and husbands, is to sacrifice themselves for the good of their wife and children.
Yeah, that's so insightful. And I feel like that not only has been a theme kind of going along with all of our topics in this hour of Millennial Round Table, but so many problems that we see in our culture today is it is a very self-focused culture, but we were made for community and relationship, and we were made to, make sacrifices for other people. And the Bible calls us not even to just do that for our family, but to be willing to sacrificially love our enemies as well. And so that, I think this article that I posted, it kind of goes into, well, it's biology and it's evolutionary, but underneath that, at the real root of the issue is that this is how God made us and this is how he designed us. And so to have purpose in life, you've got to have relationship, and it's got to be meaningful relationship. So Josh, in a couple minutes before we end this hour and you hop off the Millennial Round Table for today, any final thoughts or things that you'd like to leave us with today?
Yeah, I'm so glad that you asked me that, because there's one more thing I wanted to say, that when we're talking about the issue of fatherhood, and without fail, there's probably somebody listening who grew up without a father or is growing up without a father. And for those, I would say, run to your Father in heaven. There's a reason why the scriptures call God our Father, because he fills that role. And while, yes, we do need earthly fathers, and that is good, we can find our Father in heaven and know that he is sufficient for all of our needs. So for those who are going through that, I would say there is an answer for that.
Yes, so well said, Josh. Thank you for reminding us of that. And where can anybody follow you and learn more about the ministry that you're doing?
Yeah, you can go to The Bible Explained on YouTube. That's youtube.com/@TheBibleExplained. And you can see right now I'm deep into a study on the end times, eschatology, all that kind of stuff. So if you really want to get deep on that, you can get into it. But I have lots of other videos about different topics, just diving deep in careful thinking about the scripture, which I think is so very, very important.
Yes, and thank you for the work that you do there. The Bible Explained is a great resource, so I recommend it because to bring it full circle, like we were talking about at the beginning, Peyton, we don't want to just have hot takes, including about our theology. Definitely not about that. We want to really think through issues deeply, and so that's what we're encouraging you to do on the Millennial Round Table today. And I will just mention, if you have enjoyed the topics we discussed with regard to artificial intelligence and relationships and ideas, I've done a couple series and episodes related to those things recently on the Know Why podcast as well. We're about to go to one of those breaks, but don't go anywhere because we will be back. Peyton is staying with me in studio, and then we'll be joined by Ethan Watson on the phone, and you are familiar with him. He's often a contributor to the Millennial Round Table, and we are going to discuss some things happening in politics, the big, beautiful bill, a decline in American pride among Gen Z, which might not surprise you, but we're going to dig into the why of that a little bit, and a few other issues related to millennials and young adults. So stay with us, and don't forget, you can follow along with everything we're discussing today by going to pointofview.net and click on the header for today's show, and you can follow all of the articles and read them for yourself and really dig into those issues. You can also follow us on social media, and I encourage you to do that. And in the meantime, maybe grab a notepad, be willing to take some notes as we dig into some of these issues at a deeper level and really think through them when we get back on Point of View.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
Going through the stations and caught Kirby and a very interesting topic. So just listening to it, and so just by hearing the topic, I can relate to some of those topics. But it has impacted my life a lot. I enjoy listening to the station.
I appreciate Point of View. You've been great and wonderful. A lot of information, and I really appreciate all your work you do.
My wife and I have listened to Point of View for about 17 years now. We just want you to know how much you have meant to us in our lives. I've gotten a real education since I've started listening to Point of View.
I want you to think, what would we do? How ignorant would we be if we didn't have Point of View? And come on, guys, give something to Point of View to make sure we don't lose this wonderful voice. And thanks again for what you do.
Thank you, Kirby. I consider this my school time, so my 2 hours of school each day. So thank you very much.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now your host for the Millennial Round Table, Liberty McArtor.
Welcome back to Millennial Round Table. I'm happy to be with you today, and I'm glad that you're listening. So in studio with me still for the second hour is Peyton Luke, media specialist at First Liberty Institute and the producer and co-host of First Liberty Live, one of the great resources provided by our friends at First Liberty Institute. And also joining us this hour is Ethan Watson. He is a Young Voices contributor, and he has published commentary in Real Clear Politics, The Daily Caller, many other publications, and is, of course, a frequent guest on the Millennial Roundtable here at Point of View. Ethan, welcome back to the Millennial Roundtable.
Great to be back. Thank you for having me on.
So I did want to kick off this hour with some news that happened over the weekend. On July 4th, President Trump did sign the One Big Beautiful Bill, and I'm impressed. I know there were several all-nighters pulled over the last few weeks in process and in Congress to actually get this passed and to the president's desk by the self-imposed deadline of July 4th. And so it has been passed. And I want to go around the roundtable and kind of get everybody's, takes and opinions on the bill and kind of what you liked, what you didn't like, especially as young adults and young Americans, and how this is going to impact us in the future. But I encourage you to go to pointofview.net. We have an article posted there from the Wall Street Journal that addresses some of the concerns about the safety net issue. And that is, a big concern for a lot of people. And I think the question is, how well will Republicans articulate the truth about some of these changes? Because that could really impact their midterm prospects when we get around to election cycles here before too long. So there are work requirements, of course, but, really reasonable things that a lot of Americans actually agree on. And we can dive into some of the specifics of that in a little bit. But Ethan, I'd love to get your perspective on just this huge piece of legislation that passed, and good news, bad news in it, whatever your opinion is on it. I'd love to get your perspective.
Yeah, of course. I mean, when you have an omnibus bill like this, it's really kind of Schrodinger's bill. Like, everybody can see something in it that they like and something that they don't.
Mm-hmm.
For me as a young person, I look at, the provisions that increase the deficit, and obviously I dread that, right? That's going to be me paying that off and my children and my grandchildren. So I don't love that. That said, if I were a single issue voter, my number one issue right now is immigration. I kind of yearn for the country that my parents and grandparents grew up in. And I feel that mass immigration has sort of changed the face of this country in ways. And I'm not talking about anything so superficial as ethnically, but culturally, we are a different country than we used to be. We've imported people that maybe don't share our values, don't share our language. And then there's downstream economic effects of that as well. So if I had to vote for one issue, I would vote for stronger border security and deportation operations. And I think the Big Beautiful Bill does allocate the resources that I'd like to see allocated towards that goal. And so that, at the end of the day, it's a trade-off that I had to make, but I'm fine with the Big Beautiful Bill as it stands.
Yeah, and that's a good perspective, just because the immigration crisis, the border crisis was a huge issue, a top issue in the 2024 elections. And so I think a lot of people see this as President Trump keeping his word on that issue in a way. Peyton, your reactions to the big, beautiful bill?
Yeah, 900 plus pages, as Ethan was saying. Woo! As Ethan was saying, there's always something, you like or you don't like. And I know for so many, they were trying to put so much into it at the last minute, especially when it's going back and forth between, the House and the Senate and all the different things. But I know some of the tax deductions are kind of nice. And I know specifically because I didn't know the exact amount until I was doing a little reading into it for the show and all, how the deduction for tips is limited to $25,000 per taxpayer. And the deduction for overtime is limited to $12,500 per taxpayer. I was interested in that. So for our listeners who are curious, because I know my husband occasionally gets overtime and sometimes hourly stuff. So it's interesting to know some of those things, as well as like the existing tax rates and brackets, could be permanent and all. So those are things that are really interesting and I know impact people. But also, as Ethan was saying, with the national defense and money to protect there with ICE and our military as well. So, national security is very important, but then also at home, the tax breaks and all. I think that's impactful. But also talking about one thing that we mentioned earlier in the last hour, the hot takes. I saw so many clips over social media throughout the weekend of people having very different opinions and furious about it and all these different things. So I encourage our listeners to go read and look into it and don't just take the hot takes, because sometimes, your algorithm can be misleading and might only show you one side of the coin. So definitely dive in and do some research and see what is beneficial, so that way you can articulate what you like and don't like about the bill.
Yeah, such good advice. And so again, we have some resources for you at pointofview.net. And you may have to go issue by issue because, as we've said, there was a lot covered in the bill. One of probably my top thing that I was happy about is that we can officially say now that Planned Parenthood is defunded. And so I know for many of you who are listening, the pro-life issue is close to your heart, as it is to mine. And so it has been a very incremental battle to get federal funding out of the abortion industry. And so, of course, we have the Hyde Amendment, which was passed in the 1970s. And before that, and this was a few years after Roe versus Wade was decided at the Supreme Court, the federal government was directly funding about 300,000 abortions a year. And so that was a victory. The Hyde Amendment was a victory. And so a lot of people said, well, okay, it's not, Planned Parenthood isn't being federally funded anymore by taxpayer dollars. Well, it actually was, because Medicaid funds could still be used at abortion facilities and abortion providers like Planned Parenthood, even though they couldn't technically, be used for the actual abortion procedure. We know that Planned Parenthood provides over 400,000 abortions per year. And because of this bill, 200 of their 600 locations in the United States are going to have to close. So that tells you that, yes, they really were relying on federal funding. And so now no facility that provides abortions is going to be able, or no nonprofit organization that provides abortions will be able to receive taxpayer funding. So again, there are so many things we could talk about with the bill. As both Ethan and Peyton have pointed out, there's a lot in here. There's a lot to like or dislike depending on exactly what your top issue is. But I did want to highlight this, what I consider a big pro-life victory, and we can at least be happy about that. But when we come back from the break, I want to talk about an issue that kind of was in the news over the weekend, with it being July 4th, and that's the decline in American pride, especially among Gen Zers. I don't think that takes anybody by surprise, but maybe we can dig into the why a little bit and discuss why there's a lack of pride in our nation. We'll be right back after this break.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
You know, both sides of the political spectrum warn that we are facing a constitutional crisis. Liberals argue that President Trump's actions constitute a crisis. Conservatives point instead to activist judges. Last month, the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee held a hearing entitled The Supposedly Least Dangerous Branch, District Judges versus Trump. During the hearing, Senator Ted Cruz warned that the U.S. is facing a constitutional crisis, a full-blown judicial assault on the separation of powers. He explained how these unelected district judges were abusing their authority by issuing sweeping nationwide injunctions against President Trump's policies. He further explained that in the first 150 years of the Republic, not a single nationwide injunction was issued, and only 27 were issued in the 20th century. Under Presidents Bush, Obama, and Biden, just 32, he concluded that this is not normal, this is not justice. You know, justices in the Supreme Court apparently agree. In a decision dealing with President Trump's executive order with birthright citizenship, the justices ruled 6-3 that these lower court judges do not have a right to block the president's policies nationwide. In fact, Amy Coney Barrett, writing for the majority, even took time to rebuke Ketanji Brown Jackson's rhetoric because it was at odds with centuries of precedent and the Constitution itself. She noted, "We observe only this. Justice Jackson decries an imperial executive while embracing an imperial judiciary." The conclusion is simple. We cannot give a single federal district judge the power to stop the functions of the president and Congress, who were elected by the people. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free copy of Kirby's booklet, A Biblical View on Racism, go to viewpoints.info/racism. That's viewpoints.info/racism. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
We're back on the Millennial Round Table, and before we move on from the discussion about the big, beautiful bill that was signed on July 4th, Ethan, I did want to mention that you had an op-ed a couple of weeks ago before the bill was passed, addressing some of the concerns around the provisions regarding green energy and some of the funding that's going to be taken away from that. But I thought you had some really great points, just because for millennials and members of Gen Z, the environment is such a top concern. I mean, it affects people's decisions about whether they want to have children. It really drives a lot for young adults. And you kind of bust some myths and misconceptions. And so I just wanted to know if you could maybe talk about your op-ed and some of those arguments with us for a moment.
Oh, of course, yeah. So, it's hard to talk about the big, beautiful bill without talking about the blow it deals to sort of this climate subsidies and the climate hysteria that our federal government's been kind of pushing. And a lot of young people are probably feeling anxious about that. I know my generation is very worried about climate change. I just wanted to write that piece and point out that, only extremely wealthy, extremely decadent societies have the bandwidth to care about the environment, which is why really you only see the Greta Thunbergs of the world hassling Western Europe and the United States about it. They're not, hassling Pakistan about their output or India, because those countries are still very impoverished. They don't have the bandwidth. The people there don't care about the environment because they're worried about where their next meal is coming from. And so my point with that was a lot of environmental policies make things more expensive, make energy more expensive for Americans. And once Americans start living paycheck to paycheck, they're wondering if they can put enough gas in their car to get to work or heat their home in the winter. Their bandwidth for long-term sort of higher order concerns like the climate really starts to fade away. And so I think our greatest asset in protecting the environment is our wealth. We're able to invest in green energy companies, electric cars, things like that. And we're able to sort of endure the minor inconveniences of LED lights or paper straws because our lives are so good. But once our lives start to get a lot worse and we start living more on the fringe, paycheck to paycheck, our appetite for climate talk will really go down, is my prediction. So I was just hailing the big, beautiful bill for sort of rolling back on that and preserving our prosperity as a way of actually saving the environment in the long term.
Yeah, and I appreciated that perspective because it is a concern of young adults, and we should be good stewards of creation and the world that God has given us. But you do add such an important perspective, which is we can actually do more for the environment in the long run if we avoid some of these policies that tout themselves as being good for the environment, but in the long run are actually bad for people. And again, it's a common misconception that people are bad for the environment, but people innovate, and human beings are the ones who are responsible for stewarding creation. And so we can actually really benefit our futures going forward. And I just love your perspective on that because, and this kind of leads us into the next topic, I think it really comes down to kind of a fundamental difference in worldview and perspective of being, recognizing all the things that we have to be grateful for in the United States, acknowledging that it's not perfect, but really being grateful for the lives that we do have here, which compared to the rest of the world, Americans lead very blessed, very privileged lives. But when you poll Gen Z, and there was a new Gallup poll released last week in anticipation of the 4th of July, you find that there are, record low levels of national pride among young adults. And so there is a decline in just pride in America in general, but of course, Gen Z voters, I think, are driving this. And it's interesting, Peyton, that we're seeing this trend because a lot of the things that I've seen, even comments on social media of people talking about why they are not proud of America, they list all these problems. And my perspective is kind of, I don't need to be okay with everything happening in my nation to still be proud of my nation and patriotic and love my nation. In fact, that makes me want to work to improve things more. But then there seems to be kind of maybe an out of touchness with the generation of thinking that everything has to be perfect before they can have pride. I'm not sure. What do you think?
Yeah, I feel like it is very focused on their perspective of the last few months, the last couple years, and they're letting that entirely impact their perception of America, and they're not looking at, past years and the sacrifice and, like you said, gratitude. And I know we could go talk on this so much and get so deep of the different perspectives on history and all those topics. But for right now, just talking about patriotism in general, if so many of them then also sound like they don't have much perspective outside of just their own life. Like, have you talked to, for example, my sister-in-law is an immigrant from Romania. And she and her family, went through the whole process and they're here. And they have been such good contributors to society, but they went through the official process and they are so grateful for America. They are so proud to be an American. They were waving their American flags. They are just, there's so much gratitude there because they came from communist Romania. And her parents will tell stories about it. And so I feel like there's a lack of perspective with this, with our generation, because as the poll was saying, with Gen Z voters, only 41% of whom say they are proud to be an American. And this compares to 58% of millennials, 71% of Gen X, 75% of baby boomers, 83% of the silent generation. And I know I saw several tweets over the weekend that just made me so sad. I actually saw this exact link that you have shared over the weekend, and I saw it on July 4th, and I was just kind of sitting there, and I was a little bit down about it, and my husband happens to walk by, and he's like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Yeah, I am," but it just makes me sad to see this as the perception on America. And he said something, very wise, and he's like, "Well, remember that the ones that are probably at home behind their keyboards on 4th of July and not out celebrating are the ones that are upset. There are so many more that are probably out there celebrating and proud to be an American, but they're not the ones that we see on social media." So it's also important to keep that perspective, that even just social media in general, what we see when people are typing, this July 4th is just eating potato salad at a funeral. And, things about Independence Day is canceled due to a lack of independence, and so many more that we can talk about after the break. But it's disheartening. I still have hope, and I'm so grateful for our country. But it's disheartening because it just feels like a lack of perspective, and you just want to say, hey, go travel for a little while and see how that, works out, and then come back and you'll probably have a little more gratitude.
Yeah, Ethan, we have a couple minutes before we have to go to the break, and we'll keep talking about this, but you're our resident Gen Zer today. So what's your perspective on kind of this lack of pride in America that we're seeing among younger adults right now?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Peyton's story about her family members who came over from Romania I felt a swell of pride just hearing that story. That's awesome. And I really do agree with what she had to say about how America, or Americans, we don't have a good way to conceptualize our identity. I was in high school not that long ago, and really what we learned about is Native Americans, the atom bomb, and slavery, neither of which are any events that portray America in a particularly good light. And more than that, we're sort of told that America is just an idea, which I actually take issue with. America was founded on the best ideas humans have ever produced, but in the year 2025, America is a distinct people. It's a culture. It's a nation with traditions and language and values. And that's not to say people can't join and be absorbed into it, but we need to start delineating. This is what to be an American means. It means you hold these values sacred. You behave a certain way. You believe in faith and family and freedom. We kind of have to pretend that American is just some nebulous idea that anyone who sort of shows up on our shores is immediately an American. And I want to challenge that. I think we need to delineate what it means to be an American so that people have a concrete thing to be proud of, which is this identity that's been formed over the last 250 years. It's a shared people, a shared language, a shared connection to the land, and a shared set of values. And that's what makes us not just distinct, but exceptional.
Yeah, really interesting perspective there, Ethan. Thank you for sharing that. And I want to talk about this a little bit more before we go to the break. So let me just remind you really quickly, though, that we have our Pray for America emails that you can subscribe to. And so every single week we send out prayers relating to all kinds of issues. This week, we're praying for Central Texas and the people who have experienced devastation from the floods there. And so one of the best things we can do to improve our nation and address the issues that we see here is to pray. And so go to pointofview.net, and there's a Pray for America banner there that you can click on and sign up with your email. And then more on this topic when we get back after the break.
At Point of View, we believe there is power in prayer, and that is why we have relaunched our Pray for America campaign, a series of weekly emails to unite Americans in prayer for our nation. Imagine if hundreds of thousands of Americans started praying intentionally together on a weekly basis. You can help make that a reality by subscribing to our Pray for America emails. Just go to pointofview.net and click on the Pray for America banner that's right there on the homepage. Each week you'll receive a brief news update, a specific prayer guide, and a free resource to equip you in further action. We encourage you to not only pray with us each week, but to share these prayers and the resources with others in your life. Join the movement today. Visit pointofview.net and click on the banner Pray for America right there at the top. That's pointofview.net. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in our land. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Liberty McArtor.
We're on the Millennial Round Table and we're discussing American patriotism, or maybe the lack thereof, among many young adults. And so Ethan and Peyton both have great perspectives on this issue. I would say I think that I always like to get down to the root of an issue, maybe at a worldview level or our fundamental beliefs. And I think as you have a decline in any sort of religious affiliation and certainly biblical worldview among so many young adults, that there really is kind of a misunderstanding of human nature itself. And so I think that we'll maybe see this theme throughout our topics for the rest of the show. But I think there is a lot of idealism among young people, and that's always been the case. It's easy when you're young to be idealistic, but it has to be tempered with reality. And so a young person who has a biblical worldview can, I think, still be very optimistic, but also recognize that we're all sinful, that it's a fallen world. And so that in itself gives us, I think, a different perspective, because we don't expect every leader or every nation or every circumstance to be perfect. But maybe, and you guys can, counter this if you don't agree, maybe that gives us a little bit more of an ability to be appreciative for the things that are good. For instance, the original sin of America, as many people call it, is slavery. And it still existed when America was founded. And that's a horrible thing. And that's not something I'm proud of. But I am thankful for the fact that the founding documents and the Constitution acknowledged freedom and that every person was made in God's image. And even though that wasn't practically applied at the time, it still gave us as a nation the ability to work toward living that out. And so that's one example where I think maybe there's a disconnect here on a worldview level of where we maybe expect or want everything to be perfect. And then when it doesn't measure up, we're disappointed, versus realizing things aren't going to be perfect and being optimistic about the things that are really good, especially compared to history and the rest of the world. So again, Ethan, among your peers, you were talking about just this kind of how we don't really have a cohesive sense of what our American values are anymore, or what it means to be an American. So, but you did see kind of a rightward shift in the 2024 election. So among your peers, what are those things that resonate when it comes to American identity?
Well, I think so. First of all, let's take a step back. What's captured my generation is sort of this progressive postmodern view, which is that, hey, we're always siding with the underdog. Anything that is dominant or has existed for a while and happens to be imperfect, like America or organized religion or really anything for that matter, is flawed and must be changed. And so that's what progressivism is about. It's about changing and dismantling institutions, which is why there is no reverence for the past and therefore no gratitude and patriotism. That's where we've been. But it turns out when you remove all of the higher order pleasant things from life, whether that be family, nuclear family or traditional relationships or love of country or public religion, when you suck all of that out and make life all about sort of material gain and individualistic, it turns out people get really sad. People are not happy. That's not a fun life to live. And my generation, more than any other, especially young men, are facing increasing rates of suicide, drug overdose. The alcoholism is weaning a little bit, but deaths of despair are up across the board. And so I think people are looking around and saying, hey, we've taken something out of our lives and our lives have gotten worse. And so it's time to start putting the pieces back together. And that's why you see young people going to church more than their parents did. That's why you see young men especially moving back into patriotism and into traditional values, because there's a sense that, hey, we're not doing so well as a society these days, and maybe it's because we took out all of the good things. And one last point on that, it's actually transgressive now to be patriotic. It's transgressive to believe in traditional values. It's transgressive to say things like, yeah, I do think America is great and I'm not ashamed of my country or my heritage. That's the transgressive thing to do. And young people love nothing more than to be transgressive and edgy. And I think that's driving it a lot as well.
Yeah, great perspectives on that. And I love, Peyton, how it blends with what we were talking about in the first hour. We touched on the loneliness epidemic, the masculinity crisis, our need as human beings for relationship. And those are such fundamental things. They really underscore every area of life, including patriotism.
Yeah, so important, so important. And earlier, Ethan, we were also talking about how pretty much all of us watched the Patriot over the weekend and 4th of July and just all those values. And sometimes I think it's important for us to look back and remember some of those moments and truly look at the sacrifices that the generations before us made. And why? Why did they make those sacrifices? Because they believed in the values of America. They believed in the good of their country. And so I think it's important for us to look back and think, okay, why did they? And try to learn from those moments, because so many made the ultimate sacrifice. I don't think they would have done that if they didn't believe in the good of their country and the hope that they had. And one point I wanted to mention too, of like so many people nowadays, we are imperfect people. People in general, we are imperfect, but we expect perfect government and country. Mm-hmm. Well, that's never going to happen. But we can get it as close as we possibly can and good, but it's never going to be perfect. So we need to celebrate the moments and the things that are so good about our American values and be proud to be an American. And one thing I heard over the weekend as well, it was also talking about e pluribus unum, out of many, one, and how we do need to come together and understand, that's how America came about, out of many, one, and they chose to work together and make it like happen and work. And here is this beautiful country. We just celebrated July 4th. But yeah, just kind of going back to the original post, not to be a Debbie Downer, but to look at some of these tweets when they were just like, hey, Siri, play I Hate It Here by Taylor Swift. It's like, really? And the caption was like, whatever feelings you're having about 4th of July this year, they're valid. Grief, anger, obstinance, depression, overwhelm, or all of the above simultaneously. And I know then there's one more of like, 249 years to build, 6 months to destroy. Born the 4th of July, died on the 3rd. And it's just like, really, the anger behind it, it's hard to even describe. Like they were saying, the obstinance, and it just feels like a lack of perspective, and they're just kind of wallowing in their frustrations or some of those other things, but it's not looking at the broader picture again. Why did the founders do what they did? Being grateful, looking at some other, countries and comparing it and understanding, yes, we are imperfect people, but don't just complain about it. Be part of the solution and be in there, because it's easy to just have a hot take. It's easy to write a frustrated tweet. That is not helping with the overall solution and contributing to your country and helping just be part of the solution and be proud to be an American. Mm-hmm. Like, it is incredible to be here, to have this opportunity to be on the air with a show called Point of View that's a Christian talk show. Do you know how many countries we would not be able to have this conversation right now, or that we would be killed for having it, or our families would be threatened? We should be so grateful that we have the opportunity to even have this show for people to listen. And it's just incredible. And America has so many blessings, and we need to be proud of that.
Yeah. So well said, Peyton. And, I think it is a perspective issue. And that's why we can talk about this and it's maybe frustrating or we don't completely understand. But I do get encouraged because, I'm hearing you talk. Ethan, I'm hearing what you have to say, and I'm seeing these trends in these articles of a lot of young people are realizing that something is missing. And so you're seeing positive trends as well. And you are seeing I think a lot of young adults realize that the worldview that they have built with the hot takes, as we were discussing earlier in the show, and this very negative way of understanding reality without any sense of absolute, moral understanding or hope. I think people are turning away from that. And as Ethan mentioned, you do see people going back to church. You see people kind of returning to those traditional values again. And that's why it's important for us to discuss, but to have that biblical worldview as a part of the discussion, because that is the core of all of it. So I'm thankful to be a part of the Millennial Round Table, because I feel like I'm always inspired by my fellow panelists here on the Millennial Round Table, and I hope that you are too as you're listening. So we're about to go to a break, but we do want to continue discussing kind of a similar topic. Why are young people so taken with socialism? And what I want us to do is try to understand why they feel this way so that we can better address the concerns. We'll be right back after this break.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Welcome back to the Millennial Round Table. A few more minutes of the show today. So let's talk about what's happening in New York. I know you've already heard about it, but let's talk about it from the Millennial and Gen Z perspective here. Zohran Mamdani won the Democratic primary for the mayoral race in New York City. And so he's running as, he identifies as a Democratic socialist. And so there's another article I posted at pointofview.net that I think lends some helpful perspective. It's by Lucy Biggers. She says, I helped AOC win. I understand the fantasy Zohran is selling. And then she says, growing up has taught me that prosperity comes from less government, less regulation, and lower taxes, not more of them. So we've seen in the past that young adults tend to be a little more liberal or progressive with their political viewpoints. And then as they age, they get more conservative because I think maybe it's the dose of reality that hits somewhat. So Ethan, as somebody, you know, Zohran is very popular among Gen Z. That really was kind of, you know, the young adult coalition, so to speak, that helped elect him in New York City or helps him to win the primary there. So what's your perspective on kind of this article and why young adults keep falling for the lie that socialism is going to lead to prosperity?
I think the article is fascinating and really just a testament to the adage that if you're not a liberal when you're young, you don't have a heart, and if you're not a conservative when you're old, you don't have a brain.
Mm-hmm.
I love that saying. I remember my dad telling that to me when I was a small child. I guess I lost my heart pretty early because I sort of see through the Zoran Mamdani crowd. But really, I think Gen Zers, look, we like to view ourselves as compassionate, right? We like to view ourselves, especially sort of upper class, college educated Gen Zers, which is kind of who I'm surrounded with. We like to think that we can solve all the problems of the world. We want to help those less fortunate than us because our lives are so good. I completely understand that. The Democrats and progressives have really monopolized that narrative. I've talked about this on the show in the past, but they've really done a good job of holding themselves out as we are the ones that care about the poor and downtrodden and the disadvantaged. And so to me, this highlights a real messaging problem for those of us on the right, because I think that our viewpoints are quite compassionate, right? My viewpoints on immigration may sound harsh if your compassions lie with illegal immigrants, but they're quite compassionate if your compassion lies with Lake and Riley and others who've been victimized by mass migration. My viewpoints on these government-run grocery stores may sound discompassionate if you want everyone to have free food across the board, but it's compassionate if you look at it from the point of I want a sustainable economy that can make everyone wealthier in the long term. And so we need to start delivering that message in a more clear way. And look, I'm a big Daily Wire guy. I love listening to Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager and the like, but we need someone who's a little more charismatic and a little more energetic than that. And then we also need to not be transgressive anymore, because you have guys on the far right, like the Nick Fuentes of the world, that love to just say offensive things and hate monger. And, it's sort of counterproductive. We need something right down the middle. We need sort of this charismatic, articulate Zoran Mamdanis of the right. That's what we need to have. And I don't think we've quite found that yet. And I think that's going to be our path to victory. We need to communicate our ideas more effectively.
Yeah, such an interesting and I think true point on messaging among conservatives and really articulating the ideas and the philosophy in a compelling way, which is just not necessarily a strength, I think, that you see on the right. What do you think, Peyton?
Yeah, I think the left has definitely done a better job with the art of charisma and connecting with the younger voters. There was a point in this article that I just wanted to read because it was said so well. And it's true, because she says, I still have sympathy for young people who see inequality and poverty and want to do something about it. Their hearts are in the right place, but sadly, the promises that charismatic people like Mamdani and AOC sell are not the solutions that young people are seeking. They have been mistakenly taught that our capitalist society is the source of all their problems and that the only way to fix it is more government spending. So whether from lack of life experience or just pure ignorance, they fail to realize the programs offering, quote, free everything have to be paid for, and nothing is free. And at the end, she talks about how she wants to extend, grace to these people and realize that most of them don't have any idea what they're supporting with these ideas, and that's many of these ideas literally ruin civilization. And they want to make the world a better place. But then people like Mamdani, with his charming demeanor and understanding of social media, is promising them those things. So I think Ethan is right, and we need to get better at our messaging to help them understand. And part of me also wants to be real with it. And it's like, okay, you don't want to sugarcoat things or just be kind of fake with this facade of charisma. But there is something to being articulate and communicating and connecting with people, making them understand why certain things matter. One of my favorite quotes on charisma is, don't let your charisma take you where your character can't keep you. So we need people of character who also have charisma to be in there and to connect with the young people and help explain to them these things, so that the way they can help them make the world a better place, but also educate them in how that can be possible.
Yeah, great points. And I'll point out that something that we have seen again and again, including another poll recently, so many Americans view their political opponents as, quote, downright evil. And so I appreciate the tone of this article from the Free Press, because she does give a lot of grace to young voters who are feeling this way. And as she says, their hearts are in the right place. But if we aren't willing to talk with people who have different opinions than us and get that perspective, like you were saying, Ethan, then we're going to be very close-minded, and we're not going to win any hearts or any minds. And so that's something that I think we can definitely work on. I can't believe that we're already nearly at the end of the show today, Ethan, but before we close out in a couple minutes, any final thoughts or advice on where people can follow more of your work? Because you're one of those articulate and charismatic voices that I think people should be paying attention to.
Well, I certainly appreciate that. And I'm part of the Young Voices Network. We've got a lot of sort of heterodox, sort of libertarian, right-leaning young people out there that are trying to put their voices out, unafraid of cancel culture or any other consequences, which is a lot of fun. But my last word for people on our side of this fight is that we need to be magnanimous, right? Don't turn your nose up at people just because you disagree with them on the 1%, accept them for the 99%. Extend an arm, or a hand rather, reach across the aisle. And treat your opponents with grace, right? Take the high ground. I wrote an article about this, Make America Graceful Again. It was the first one I ever talked about on this station. And I truly believe that let's treat our opponents with grace and be magnanimous when they eventually have a change of heart. I just hope that comes before the bread lines start up there in New York City. But if you're interested in following more of my work, you can check me out on X at ERWatson13. That's where I'm trying to grow my following.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ethan. Peyton, where can people follow more of your work and what's happening at First Liberty Institute?
Yeah, so First Liberty is firstliberty.org. And again, we defend religious liberty across America in the legal system. So whether that is local, state, or all the way up to the Supreme Court. We have some great cases that are going on. And so you can check that out. Or if you would like to watch the show, First Liberty Live, it's firstlibertylive.com. So that's where you can find out a lot of the work of First Liberty.
Wonderful. Well, it's been great having you in studio today, Peyton, and it's been great doing the Millennial Round Table with you. Thank you for listening. If you want to share more resources with maybe young adults in your lives where we are tackling issues like these, then again, just a reminder, we have lots of podcasts available through Point of View, so you can follow me at knowwhypodcast.com. Megan, our audio engineer, puts together Point of View highlights, which you can find. And so thank you, Megan, and thank you, Steve, for producing the show. And thank you again for being with us on the Millennial Round Table. We'll see you on Point of View tomorrow.
It was not that long ago that censorship appeared to be almost inevitable. Free speech was being attacked and strangled in many places. And some of us wondered if this was the end. But now, many feel a new sense of hope, a chance for a fresh dawn. Let me caution you, now is not the time to relax. It's a time to press forward, to use this fresh opportunity to proclaim and learn how to apply truth to current issues. By the fact you're here, listening right now, that tells me that you recognize the vital role Point of View plays as a voice of truth. For more than 50 years, we've informed and equipped people who have made a real difference. And when you give to Point of View today, you breathe life into what can be a new golden era for the truth. Please, take a moment right now and invest in truth. Visit pointofview.net or give it 1-800-347-5151. That's pointofview.net. Click in now or call 1-800-347-5151. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.